Hi, I'm Richard Juckes. I work for the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare. It's our shiny, newish building in Canberra. Normally it looks a bit different because there's normally 300 cars parked in 200 spots outside. There's about 400 of us. We're Australia's leading provider of health statistics and welfare statistics, especially on things like health expenditure or hospital statistics. We're the go-to place. Within there, I work in a particular area which is described called burden of disease analysis. So what I'll go through is what is burden of disease analysis and why is it worth doing, and then we'll go through some of our findings on what are the leading diseases contributing to the health burden on Australians. What are some of the risk factors driving that? And in particular, we'll have a look at occupational risks. And then, since we'll have to skim over some of this stuff, where to go if you are interested in finding out more. So the idea of burden of disease analysis is to be able to measure the impact that ill health has on Australians. And I guess the idea is that instead of just saying X number of people die of something or so many people have something, how can we put that in a common metric so that we can figure out which diseases or illnesses or injuries are doing the most damage? What we do to get it on the same metric is separately look at people dying from diseases and people living with diseases. So the first component of this is years of life lost. It's one thing to say, 1,000 people died of disease X, but not all deaths, no one likes dying, but not all deaths are equal. The consequences of dying when you're 99 are not viewed the same as if you're 19. For example, prostate cancer kills a lot of Australians, but the average age at which they die of it is 89, and the average life expectancy of men in Australia is 81. So bad as it isn't doing the same damage as something like, for example, motor vehicle accidents, where many much younger people die. So what we do with years of life lost is we look at the age at which someone died of something compared with how much longer we would have expected them to live. So the difference is years of life lost. All the deaths in Australia, about 150,000 a year, are looked at in that context and attributed to the diseases and the risk factors that caused it. The second component is about living with diseases. There are some diseases that don't kill you or don't always kill you, but that you don't want to have anyway. And that is, what we do with these is we look at how many people have them, and then we look at how serious they are. Measuring how serious they are is done by giving everything a weight between 0 and 1. So 0 means you're in perfect good health. 1 is basically the equivalent of being dead. That is, you've completely lost that year of healthy life. So these weights, based on surveys done around the world to test how people feel about living with different levels of disability, give everything a measure of the severity. So a serious brain injury might be a 0.6. That is, although it's hard to think of it in these senses. In this sense, it's 60% as bad as being dead. Tooth decay might have a weight of 0.02 or 0.01, for example. Only impacts your life slightly. What this allows us to do is take everyone who has everything, who has all these things, multiply it by the weights, and calculate the amount of disability being inflicted by different illnesses on people. Once we've done both of those, we have them on the same metric, we can add them together and get something called a disability adjusted life year, or DALY. That is the number of years lost either to death or to ill health via disability. And that allows us to add things together and get a total burden. Now, the point of going to all this work, and it ends up being a lot of work, is that it gives us a proper understanding of the actual impact of ill health. It's one thing to say, this many people die of something, but this takes into account when they die and how much life they've lost. It also means it's another thing to say, so many million Australians have this condition, but this takes into account how serious it is. It allows us to really look at where the burden of ill health sits in terms of age, diseases and everything else. It also allows us to link these to risk factors, many of them modifiable, in order to see what changes to certain factors of how we live our lives or organise our society feed into that burden of ill health. So the most recently published of these results refers to the year 2011. We're currently working on a 2015 version. This is published, it's on our website. We look at 17 different disease groups, 200 different diseases, about 30 risk factors, and we show the results split by age, sex, state, socioeconomic status, etc., to see, which diseases are doing how much damage and to who. Just give myself a drink. So, I'll take a bit of time to go over this graph, which gives a picture of the burden of disease over the course of someone's life. So down on the bottom axis, we've got our age from 0 to 100 plus. And then the columns show the total amount of disease burden, that is the total amount of DALYs, the total amount of years lost to death and disability. The pale blue is years lost to disability, that is the burden of actually living with illness. The dark blue shows years of life lost, that is the actual impact of people dying at those ages. The dark line that you can see running up here shows the rate per person. So although the columns are lower in the older age groups, that's because there's hardly anyone in those age groups. And you can see that the per person burden gets greater as you get older. Now, circling the working age part of the graph, we can observe a few things. One is that if we look at the columns, people aged, in this case 20 to 64, actually carry a lot of the burden of ill health in Australia. The columns grouped in that square make up 50% of the total disease burden in Australia. So while we tend to think about disease and ill health as being an old person thing, and as you can see from the line, per person it is, if you think about the actual amount of ill health in Australia being borne by Australians, half of it is in the 20 to 64 age group. And one of the sort of visualizations we use for this are these graphics, and so there's the three lines. The top one is the DALYs, that is the total burden. The middle one is the living with ill health one, and the bottom one is the dying from ill health one. Starting at the bottom, and each of the colours represents a type of disease group. So this shows the difference between what happens, where the burden comes from in terms of diseases. If we look at the bottom one, nearly 40% of the impact of the years lost to death in working age Australians comes from cancer, and another 25% from injuries. So if all you looked at was, what are people dying from, those are the things that would dominate. But if we look at the middle column, the middle line, you can see that injuries and cancer are almost not visible. The ones that people are suffering from by living with them, 30% are mental health conditions and 25% musculoskeletal conditions. So that shows, the great difference between the things that are killing people versus the things that are causing people to live in ill health. This is another of the visualizations that we use called a tile map. So each column represents an age group, if you can see that. 20 to 24 is the first one, 25 to 34, etc. So it's basically, and what this one is showing is the top 5 causes of ill health for working age men. What this graphic does is sort of give a ladder showing the order, but by having a colour scheme that matches to broad disease groups, it allows you to sort of get a visual picture of the sorts of conditions that are afflicting people at different ages. So one of the things we learn is that over the course of a working age lifespan, the health issues change. For men aged 20 all the way through to 44, the top thing that they suffer from is suicide and self-inflicted injuries. For the 20 to 24s, it's all either from our green injuries category or from our purple mental health issues category. So, really at the start, when you're a young adult male, these are the things that are doing you damage. Mental health issues and injuries. As you get older, you see some of our yellow musculoskeletal ones creep in particular back pain. And then by the time people get to middle age, it's coronary heart disease, which is becoming the dominant cause of burden, and with other things like lung cancer and COPD starting to creep up. Looking at working age women, and the picture changes a bit. There's even more of the purple, and the purple, which is our mental health conditions, anxiety disorders being the top cause of disease burden in women all the way up to age 44, before other musculoskeletal conditions come along with back pain, and then once they're older, breast and then lung cancer. Something to notice, and the difference between men and women is all the purple. That is our injuries. Hang on. Sorry, the green, the injuries, which are pretty dominant for men, especially younger men, are much less visible for women. Another thing we do is attribute this ill health to risk factors. And this is all based on searching the epidemiological literature, finding relationships between certain factors and certain diseases, looking at the population's exposure to those factors, and coming up with basically factors that apportion the amount of certain diseases in Australia to these particular factors. So we divide them into 3 groups. There's behavioural risk factors, where we include alcohol use, tobacco use, drug use, unsafe sex, physical inactivity, childhood sexual abuse and intimate partner violence. There's another group called metabolic risk factors, blood pressure, cholesterol, etc. And there's another group of environmental risk factors, where we look at air pollution, sun exposure and occupational exposures and hazards. So for this presentation, we'll have a bit of a closer look at this occupational exposures and hazard risk factor. So what we've looked at in this is a range of hazards, including physical, chemical, biological and mechanical, and includes workplace exposure to all the things you can see there. Spelling mistake. Things that cause cancer, things that give you asthma, loud noise, ergonomic stress, and in particular injury. From the literature, we found that we found 23 diseases or injury groups that could be attributed to occupational hazards. And we found that in that year, 2011, just under 90,000 disability-adjusted life years were lost due to occupational hazards, and that was just under 2% of the total burden of disease in Australia. So this shows you some of the things that we found through the literature were linked to occupational risks, and I guess they're all things that people are very familiar with. Obviously, a wide range of injuries depending on what you're doing, and quite a range of cancers that are associated with occupational hazards. This graph, so that's percentage down the bottom, and that's the percentage of the occurrences of this injury or illness, written down the left, that was found to be due to occupational hazards. So for fires, burns and scalds category within the injury, over 40% was attributed to occupational hazards. For this, that it wasn't the highest, just two were so high that they sort of spoiled the scale of the rest. I think mesothelioma is 80% attributed to occupational hazards, and another, if I can say it right, pneumoconiosis, 100%. But, so that gives a picture of how much of the occurrence of these conditions we attributed to occupational risks. Looking at it a different way, if you have, this is the total amount of disability-adjusted life years attributable to occupational risks for different types of conditions. So back pain and problems in the previous one, where is it? Yeah, second. So only about 17% of back pain and problems were attributed to occupational hazards. But because back pain is has such a heavy burden on Australians in terms of ill health, that 17% adds up to the biggest of all the sort of ill health burden attributable to occupational risks. Next biggest ones, asthma, lung cancer, mesothelioma, hearing loss, etc., as you can see. The majority of the burden caused by occupational risks is non-fatal. Out of the total of things caused by occupational hazards, almost 2/3 is the pale blue non-fatal, that is, it's causing things that people are living with rather than things people are dying from. But obviously that's very different, depending on what the condition is. So for mesothelioma, almost 98% of the burden is from dying from it rather than living with it. Same with lung cancer, but then once we get down to back pain, hearing loss, etc., the burden is being borne by people living with those rather than dying from them, as you'd expect. Another standout is that the majority of the occupational risk burden is male. 72% of the burden of ill health caused by occupational risks is suffered by men. Once again, that varies according to what the condition is, but our sort of leftover category, injury category, other unintentional injuries, is 90% borne by men, mesothelioma 87%, lung cancer 81%. This is the top 8 of the things caused by occupational risks. Back pain and problems, 64% borne by males. This is partly a result of the higher workforce participation of men, and partly a result of certain high-risk industries where male participation is much higher. This shows the disease burden attributable to occupational risks by age. The blue at the top, musculoskeletal, is quite dominant. Our method, we have that ending at 64 or 65. Our methodology suggesting that later musculoskeletal ill health after you've retired isn't due to is due to other factors, whereas the dark blue towards the bottom, which is cancer, we find that the impact, the damage done by cancer from occupational risks is often born after age 65 into older age. And the same with respiratory conditions to a lesser extent. So that's a very quick tour of what we had in 2011. My team is currently working flat out right now, preparing another one with a reference year of 2015. So you may have noticed there's quite a few years between our reference year and when it's published. I mean, that's partly because there's quite a bit of research and analysis to be done in order to put this thing out, but also some of the data takes a long time to come in. Deaths data, for example, you have to wait a couple of years for coroners to finish their work and everything before you can reliably use it. And obviously that's just a taste of a vast amount of data and analysis that we have on this. And so our website, the AHW, if you look up burden of disease, or if you email our burden of disease mailbox at ahw.gov.au, if you're interested in finding out more. That pretty much concludes. The main point is just that burden of disease analysis is a complicated and hard to explain thing, but having done it, it gives you a great tool for actually doing some real analysis and comparison of who's bearing the burden of ill health and what's causing it. Thanks.